So today I wanted to make a video about the infamous IMS bearing issue. Now, the first thing that I want to say about the IMS bearing issue is that it is a real thing that actually happens to some 911s, Boxsters, and Caymans. But, and this is a Kardashian-sized but, I think that the perception of the issue and the reality of the issue can be wildly different. And I'm going to liken this to sort of like plane crashes in the sense that we hear about all the planes that crash, but we don't hear about the thousands and thousands of planes that land safely every day. And then some people are left with the perception that air travel is dangerous. When, if you look at the numbers, you can plainly see that air travel is one of the safest forms of transportation that you can be involved in. Air travel is certainly safer than being a pedestrian or a cyclist or a driver of a car. You're much more likely to die on your way to the airport than you are to ever die in a plane crash. Yet, people are still left with the impression that air travel is dangerous. We've got people that are nervous to fly, they've got flying anxiety or phobias, those kinds of things. And it's really mainly a difference between perception and reality. The IMS bearing issue is a little bit the same in that we hear about all of the issues, but we don't hear about all the cars that don't have issues. So when you take a closer look at the numbers, the issue itself, in some ways, is very different from the perception of the issue. The IMS bearing issue is definitely, it's an expensive car repair if it happens, but it's not a safety issue like some other kinds of issues with cars can be. For example, braking issues or your car going into gear unintentional acceleration. These are issues that can cost people their lives. The IMS bearing issue, while it is quite expensive if it happens, or at least can be, it isn't really a safety issue in any way. Now, I'll admit myself that when I first realized that I could potentially buy a 911, I was quite excited that I could afford, a good version of a 911. And once I stopped just looking at cars specifically for the ones that I could buy and started researching the car, one of the first things I came across, of course, it was the IMS bearing issue. And I almost didn't buy a 911 based on the little information that I had at the time related to the IMS bearing. So I've got a good friend who's also really into cars, my friend Simon. And at the time he was driving an M3. And I said, I don't know if I'm going to buy a 911 because I keep hearing about this IMS bearing issue. And I happen to be the type of person for whom, reliability is really high on my priorities list when I'm looking at cars, especially cars that I'm considering buying. And I remember he said to me, Dave, the very same thing happened to me when I was looking for M3s. I started researching them, looking on the forums and online, and all I kept coming across was the variety of problems that can arise. Now, some big and some small. And he said, same thing. It almost stopped me from buying them. And then you realize that you can look up any car. The nice thing about the internet is you can find basically anything you're looking for. So if you're looking for problems, you're sure to find them. So anyways, he went on to buy the M3 and drove it for the course of over 8 years and had some, normal car issues, but none of the monstrous issues that he had sort of been reading about that were going to keep him from buying the car. So I started thinking about that myself. I started thinking about the fact that, I hear about car issues related to all cars. Maybe instead of having this sort of knee-jerk reaction like, I guess I'm not going to buy a 911 now, maybe that I would research the IMS bearing issue a little bit more on my own. So what I thought I'd do today is sort of summarize a bunch of the information that I ended up finding. Because once I started researching this issue, I became kind of obsessive about it. I just started reading and finding and watching everything that I could on this particular issue. So the years that I'm going to be talking about basically are cars that are manufactured between 1997 and 2008. And these are the years that are most closely associated with the IMS bearing issue, kind of. And I say kind of because in that time, Boxsters, Caymans, and 911s had 3 different types of IMS bearings. From 1997 to about the mid 2000s, the Boxsters, Caymans, and 911s were using a dual row IMS bearing. And that IMS bearing is actually not really associated with IMS bearing issues. From the mid 2000s to the mid 2005 cars, they went to a single row IMS bearing, which is related to the IMS bearing issue. It happens to be the IMS bearing that has the highest failure rates. In mid 2000 to 2008, they went to a single row IMS bearing, but a much bigger one, which actually, of the 3 styles of IMS bearings, is the least failure prone and the most robust IMS bearing of any of the cars. So when I first started looking at the issue, one of the first things I did was I went down to the garage that I now take my car to. Actually, I haven't had to take my car to the garage for any repairs, but it's the garage that I went to get my inspection and to get my safety. And I brought it to that particular garage because the owner of the garage works mainly on European cars, including Porsches, of course. And he races Porsches himself. So I knew he'd know a lot about the cars. And I asked him about the IMS bearing issue. And he said he was well aware of the issue, but he himself had never seen the issue in real life. So he services most of the Porsches, or many of the Porsches at least, that are in my city, and he had yet to see an IMS bearing failure in real life. So the IMS bearing issue really relates mostly to the single row IMS bearing that was in cars between mid 2000 and mid 2005. And the numbers that I was able to find for this particular bearing and its failure rate were somewhere between 3 and 5%, probably due to the specific model of car that you're talking about. For some reason, it seems to be that the S cars seem to suffer from the issue a little bit more than the other cars. But you can see a failure rate of 3 to 5%, although is unacceptably high. It's unacceptable from a manufacturer's standpoint, and it's certainly unacceptable from a consumer standpoint. It still is nowhere close to the inevitable problem that many people portray it to be. Just to put that into normal terms, even if you took a car lot that had 50 used Porsches on it, that were all built between, say, 2001 and 2004, the most failure-prone cars that were produced. Out of those 50 cars, you're really talking about 2 cars, maybe 3, that will ever have some IMS bearing issue. Now, that is a high rate, like I said, higher than acceptable rate. But that does mean that you're going to be able to pick 47 or 48 out of 50 cars that will never suffer from the IMS bearing issue. And that's of the cars that have the highest failure rates. You also might assume that this issue is suffered by cars that are driven really hard or, mistreated the most, and that's actually also not true. I was kind of surprised to find out that it is slightly more prone in cars actually that are low mileage, rarely driven, and when they're driven, not driven very hard, because one of the issues with the IMS bearing is it's a load issue, and if you drive your car at much lower RPMs, the load on each individual bearing is actually higher. This high failure rate is certainly what caused Porsche to change the design of the IMS bearing and upgrade it in the mid 2005s. And it's also what prompted the consumer lawsuit against Porsche related to the IMS bearing. So I myself chose to deal with the IMS bearing issue in my own way. What I decided was that I was just going to simply buy a car that was manufactured after 2005. That way I would be sure to be getting the upgraded IMS bearing that is not considered to have IMS bearing issues. Now, that is not to say that my IMS bearing can't fail. Of course, when you build tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of anything, especially anything that's as complicated as a car's engine or a car itself, you're going to have failures. But it is not considered to have IMS bearing issues. I mean, if I was going to worry about IMS bearing issues, I might as well worry about having a piston rod snap or my crankshaft bend or have valve problems or my engine block crack. I mean, there are lots of things to worry about. I just chose a car that was after the cars that are considered to have the more serious IMS bearing issues. Now, if you were to choose a car that was built between mid-2000 and mid-2005, the nice thing is there are a whole variety of options that you can use to overcome the IMS bearing issue. Because it's an issue, there have been a number of different aftermarket fixes for the problem. I know of some of them. I know LN Engineering, for example, makes a lubrication system that can help with the problem. There's aftermarket bearings that you can buy that help solve the problem. And you're generally talking somewhere between, $1,000 and $2,000 to fix the problem. And again, that doesn't mean that there's no way that those aftermarket solutions could ever fail. I mean, it's possible too. But it is one way to help combat the problem. The good thing about the problem, and especially the issue related to the problem, is that because this perception exists, the prices of the cars already reflect the issue. So in a sense, you're sort of saving at least as much money as the issue would ever cost you. And certainly you're saving way more money than any of the fixes to the problem would cost you. So that's one of the ways that maybe you can kind of exploit the perception issue related to the IMS bearing failure rates. Another thing that you could definitely do, and I would suggest, is if you are thinking of buying a 911 Cayman or Boxster, is have a pre-purchase inspection. And they can use a bore scope, look in the cylinders, see if there's any cylinder boring. And, even if it's just for your peace of mind, then changing out the IMS bearing or putting in one of the aftermarket solutions for, another $1,000 to $2,000 might just be the solution for you. So also keep in mind that if you do choose to switch out the bearing or use one of the aftermarket solutions, if you just look at the statistics, you are probably about 20 to 25 times more likely to change out an IMS bearing that was never going to fail in the first place than you are to change one that was going to fail. But for your peace of mind, it may well be worth it. Anyways, I hope that you found this video helpful. I know I was nervous about buying a 911 and hearing about the IMS bearing issue until I researched it a little bit further and started delving a little bit more into the reality as opposed to the perception. I've made a couple videos about how practical I think my 911 is and what a great car I think it is and what a great value it is. And I still get a number of comments in my comment section like, yeah, well, talk to me in 3 years when your IMS bearing fails and you need to replace your engine. And I have to say, I think that's a perfect example of how a little information can be dangerous. I never get those types of comments from anybody who has actually owned a Porsche before. In fact, if you look through my comments on most of my videos, most people that comment that have actually owned Porsches completely agree with the positive experiences that I talk about and have mentioned in my videos. And I'm not naive. I'm sure that if I have the car long enough, I will face some problems. I genuinely hope I don't have any major problems. But I have driven this car for 3 driving seasons so far without a single issue. I have not yet brought the car back to that mechanic that I talked about earlier who did my inspection and who I go to for advice when I want to know things about European cars, either my BMW or this Porsche. So if you found the video helpful, give it a like and subscribe. And hopefully, even if you decide not to get a 911 or one of the Porsches from this era, at least now you will have made an informed decision. All right, I'll see you on the next one.